Hey everyone, David with DTR Wood Designs. Appreciate you clicking on the link. This is going to be, I guess, what you would call a beginner's guide to doing a live edge epoxy charcuterie board. This one is going to kind of walk through the process of doing a two-stage pour, color and then clear. And what that does by doing the two different pours is it really gives you a three-dimensional look to the board, and also great visibility of the live edge, which in my opinion that's what makes the board. I mean, that's why you're picking the type of lumber you are. This is a great picture right here, kind of showing you what that means, and I think it looks great. So let's get started. First, obviously, the most important part is picking out your lumber. I was able to come across this beautiful slab of cherry. It's about 10 feet long. I should be able to get 4 or 5 boards out of it. But man, the edge on this, it's clean, it's smooth. A lot of pits, which we'll be able to clean up while doing the process, but great board to start with. First thing you're going to want to do is obviously square off the slab. Then we're going to want to measure off our sections for the charcuterie board, and I typically do 24 inch by 12 inch. Then obviously cutting the slab, a track saw is most beneficial, but whatever kind of saw you have, just get your piece cut out. Next, we're going to head over to the planer. This is going to be a long process. You're only going to see a few passes here on the video, but you're going to be doing quite a few. Just make sure and take off a little bit at a time. The more you try and take off at once, the more opportunity you have for blowout to happen on the wood. Now back to the track saw, and let's get that board cut in half. Now we're going to take each board over to our table saw to square up the edges so it's straight when we put it in the mold. Next, I like to brush on a light coat of epoxy on the live edge side of both pieces. This helps fill any cracks or voids because remember, it is live edge, so there could be a lot of cracks and holes, and it's very porous, even things that you may not see. And this helps alleviate any air bubbles when you do the actual pour. Now it's time to mix up the epoxy. Whatever you're comfortable with, I use a 1-to-1 ratio, and what I use is up to an inch thick pour. But I typically only pour about 3/4 of an inch at a time. For this board, we're going with this Japanese steel gray eye candy pigment. Now this next part is purely up to you. Just remember, when you're using pigment, it goes a long way. So kind of mix up and check your results. Just make sure everything gets dissolved into the epoxy. Now it's time to pour. Just make sure your boards are supported either with clamps or some sort of heavy brick. As you can see, I'm using pavers on this one. The boards are surprisingly light, and the epoxy will cause them to float no matter what type of form you're using. A quick little once over with the torch to get out the initial air bubbles. Depending on what type of epoxy you're using and the hardening time and setting time, towards the end is when you want to go ahead and play around with your pigment, to just kind of create a custom design or leave it as is. It's up to you. Now my board sat for 24 hours and it's time for the clear part of the pour. And just as it sounds, you're going to mix up your epoxy the same way we did with the color and pour it right on top. If you happen to let the board sit for more than 24 hours before you do the clear pour, you're going to want to lightly sand the color part of the pour with like a 220 grit sandpaper just to rough it up a little bit. Now another pass over the torch. At this point, the board has been curing for about 3 or 4 days, and it's time to plane off all the excess. Sorry, I forgot to video that part. And then after that, you're going to want to square up all the edges. Now next, for my boards, I like to throw a 3/8 inch round over edge on each side of the board, but completely up to you. No edge is needed, it's just personal preference. Now on to sanding. Look, Everybody be patient with this part, and you'll see if you're checking on different videos, everybody's got their different way of sanding their epoxy, their charcuterie boards. This is the process that's worked for me. These are all the different grits I'm using with the America screen sandpaper. I feel it doesn't get clogged up as quick, so I like to use it. I'm able to blow it out after each pass, just in case it starts to get clogged up. You're going to go over with each grit up to 600 on the whole board. After 600, you're only going to go over the epoxy portion of the side of the board. You also want to make sure that you're going a pass vertically and a pass horizontally to make sure and catch any spots that might have been missed. Make sure while you're sanding, you're also making sure your sanding pad is not getting clogged up with debris, and also at the same time make sure you're wiping down your board after each pass so you're not sanding dust into it. Now after the sandpaper, we move on to polishing pads, and there's 4 different pads here, and we do this dry, we do not wet sand it. For the polishing pads, it's only needed to go over the epoxy portion of the board, but you still want to make sure and wipe down the board between each pass. Now comes what I like to refer to as the satisfying part, getting the shine on the board and really see how clear you got that epoxy section. I apologize, I had started half the board and realized I didn't start the video. But what I use is a product called Lolio, and it's a single coat hard wax oil, 2-part. The second part is just a little bit of hardener to put in there so it sets up good on the board. With all my projects, I apply any kind of oil with white Scotch-Brite pads. They're cheap. You can pick them up on Amazon, big packs of them for very inexpensive. Once the oil's been applied, I let it sit for 15 minutes. Then I come back with a cotton towel or rag and polish off any excess that may have not been absorbed in the board. And then I normally let the board sit for about 48 hours before use. Hope you enjoyed the video, and hopefully it answered any questions you might have, or if anything, gets you started on creating your first live edge epoxy charcuterie board. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments. Thanks.